The Book of Beginnings, lesson 17, passing on the covenant. The last several sessions, we have been talking about Abraham and the covenant that God made with Abraham, and the fact that he was the beginning of the Jews, of the faith that we read about. The law and the Mosaic law and so on came about because of the covenant that God made with Abraham. But Abraham was a human being, so sooner or later Abraham was going to die. And so then we have to be able to, the covenant had to be passed along to the next generation, to the next generation, to the next generation, right on down. And so that's what we're going to talk about now as the next step as we're getting past Abraham. And our first scripture I want to start with is Genesis 25, verse 1. And it says, "Now Abraham had taken another wife, whose name was Keturah, and she bore him Zimran, Jokshan, Medan, Midian, Ishbak, and Shua." So, why do I bring up this, and what do we know about Keturah? If you remember a couple of weeks ago when I was talking about this, I said there's some Jewish rabbis and Christian teachers, as far as that goes, that believe, they don't know this for a fact, nobody does, and I don't know that it is a fact, but they believe, some believe, that Keturah was actually Hagar. That Hagar was, the reason it referred to Hagar as a concubine, referred to Keturah as his wife, is because when she came back into the relationship after Sarah, she became his wife. That's all conjecture. We don't know if any of that's true. All we know is we have Keturah's name here, and it said he took another wife, and her name was Keturah. We don't know, and I'll just say this for sure. It says he took her. When did he take the wife? Was it 20 years before Sarah died? Was it 30 years before Sarah died? Was it after Sarah died? It would imply it was after she died, but it doesn't say for sure. So there's a lot that we're not told there, and because there's a lot we're not told, people come up with conjecture and come up with all these kind of synopsis of what they think could have happened, and then each one of them going to tell you this is what the truth is, and when the truth is, you don't know. If it doesn't tell you directly in the Bible or any other source, you don't know. So there is no writing to uphold any of that. So, but there's something important about Keturah that I want to tie in with what we're talking about tonight, is the reason I bring it up. And I want to take us to Exodus for just a few passages of Scripture to give you an idea of why she's important. Exodus 2:15, it says, "When Pharaoh heard about this, he tried to kill Moses." We know what this is. This is when Moses killed the Egyptian and Pharaoh was going to kill him. So Moses fled Pharaoh and went to live in the land of Midian, and sat down by the well. And you skip down to the 16th verse. It says, "Now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters." Down to the 21st verse, it says, "Moses agreed to stay with the man, and he gave his daughter Zipporah to Moses in marriage. She gave birth to a son whom he named Gershom. For he said, 'I have been a foreigner in a foreign land.'" So what does that have to do with Keturah? He went to the land of Midian. Who was one of her children? One of her children was Midian. So the land that he went to was the descendants of Keturah, who were the descendants of Abraham, because Abraham had basically 3 wives, and he had children by all 3 of them. And so this is his wife Keturah, and she had, you see the one I have underlined, is Midian. So the back here in this, back other way. Now the priest in Midian, who was the priest there? Who was the one on the Beverly Hillbillies? Jethro. That's one of his name, Ruah and Jethro. So his name was Jethro. So, but he was not the one on the Beverly Hillbillies. So, but he was the priest in Midian. So he was in the land that came from the descendants of Keturah. Now, how's that tie in? So I've got a little thing here to look at. Moses married a Midianite. Okay. Moses was a descendant of Isaac. So he marries a Midianite who's the descendant of Keturah and Abraham. Moses was a Levite who married a Midianite. Aaron, his brother, was a Levite as well. Levites were descended from Sarah and Keturah. Not through Moses they were, because not through Aaron, but through Moses, because he married a Midianite. So his children, who were part of the Levites, everybody that was a descendant of theirs were Levites. Anybody that was a descendant of Levi, one of the 12 sons of Israel, 12 sons of Jacob, were Levites. But you can be a Levite and not be a priest, but you couldn't be a priest and not be a Levite, because you had to be a descendant of Aaron's in order to be a priest, and you couldn't be a descendant of Aaron if you're not a descendant of Levi, because he was a descendant of Levi. All that makes sense? So anyway, because of this, you see that she's tied in as well. So this family tree is tied together in a way other than what you think a lot of times, because he was also a Midianite. And it talks about Jethro being the priest. Well, it doesn't go into any detail of what kind of priest. If it was of the same faith as Moses, if he followed the covenant of Abraham, it never tells us any of that. It just said he was a Midianite priest. That's all it tells us. But what we do know is that the Levites, and later on, as we see, after you get past Moses and you get to his descendants and Aaron's descendants, they're also descendants of some of them of Keturah as well as Sarah. So I'll try to get off of that before we get hung up anymore. So, Genesis 25:5. Abraham gave everything he owned to Isaac. He gave everything he owned to Isaac. Why? Because Isaac was the son of promise. We already have seen that he has several sons by one wife, by Keturah, and he has one son by Hagar, which is Ishmael. But he says he gave everything to Isaac. And Abraham gave gifts to the sons of his concubines, but while he was still alive, he sent them eastward away from his son Isaac to the land of the east. He didn't want that to be confused in any way. The covenant was made with Abraham that was supposed to be passed on through Isaac, not through any of the rest of his sons, but through Isaac. Now, we know that the other sons of his were blessed as well, and Ishmael was blessed, and he explains the tribes that came from Ishmael. So Ishmael had many descendants and became a great nation as well as Isaac did. So while he sent them away so they wouldn't be contaminating the line of the son of the promise, is the way I would put it. So send them to the land of the east. 7th verse. This is the length of Abraham's life, 175 years. He lived to be 175 years old. This is the length of Abraham's life, 175 years. He took his last breath and died at a ripe old age. I'd say so. 175. Died at a ripe old age. Old and contented, and he was gathered to his people. 9th verse. His sons Isaac and Ishmael buried him in the cave of Machpelah near Mamre, in the field of Ephron, the son of Zohar the Hittite. This was the field that Abraham bought from the Hittites. Abraham was buried there with his wife Sarah. So he died, and he was gathered to his people. And so I want to look at that verse for just a minute and what it said. As you read through the Old Testament, Genesis right on through the end of the last book in the prophets, it doesn't talk a lot about heaven or hell. It doesn't. The most that we know about heaven and hell is taught in the New Testament more so than in the Old Testament. And so they use different terms. And he used this term here. It said he was gathered to his people. And here's a quote from a Jewish rabbi. He says, Jews call the afterlife Olam Haba, world to come, and Gan Eden, Garden of Eden. Belief in an afterlife is core to Judaism, is a foundation stone without which the entire structure would collapse. This is the view of some Jews, not all of them, but this is his view. Some of them believe that the first one you see here is where the Jews go when they die, and they go through a period of purification, and then they can go to the Garden of Eden, Gan Eden. And so it's sort of like it's similar to the Catholics' belief in purgatory. Purgatory is not a place for sinners to go so they can, or people that are not born again go to in order to be born again. It's a place where they go through, where believers go to who've not, this is my way of putting it, have not reached the state of purification that they need to have been in order to make it into heaven, so they have to go to a stop-off point, which the Catholics believe is purgatory. We don't believe in purgatory, and there's many reasons why we don't, but that's what they believe. And there's some Jews that believe something very similar to that, as you can see about what they're talking about here, that you have this stop-off place, and then once you get to the point where you're pure enough, then you can go to the Garden of Eden, which is in what we would call heaven. Another quote from the Jew. It begins with the belief that within the human being resides a spark of the divine. In Hebrew, that's called neshama. Neshama literally means breath. Think of it as God, and you see the way it's spelled God. This is a quote I copied from a Jewish writer. Most Jewish writers will not write G-O-D. They'll write G and a slash, underscore, and the D. They won't write the O-N because of the commandment not taking the Lord's name in vain, and they're afraid that they might miswrite it or something if they write in that letter, so they don't write in that letter. So do what you want to with that. Think of it as God breathing within the human body, as in the scene from God formed Adam out of the earth, and he blew into his nostrils the breath of life. Just as God is forever, so too the neshama is forever. So he's saying the reason that it'll be forever is because once God breathes this life into someone, this life is forever. Well, that's similar to what we believe, except some of the Jews believe that their spirits wandering around out here, and they're breathed into this world, and they live in this world a while, and then they go to the one stage of heaven and to another stage of heaven. Some of them believe they go to, it gets confusing, but it's not what we believe. So if you hear any of this, this is what you would hear. I think I've got this down here, but let me get past this. Gathered to his people. It's stating that there's a place of departed souls. Now, what would we call that? Heaven. Where are your loved ones that have passed on that were believers in Jesus Christ? Where do we believe they are? They're in heaven. So what they believe, they use the description here, the writer here in the book of Genesis says he was gathered to his people. So gathered to his people is like saying that he was in heaven. And there's some here, and I got a quote here, Judaism does not affirm the belief in an afterlife. Rather, we live on through our good works and in the memories of our loved ones. I worked with a Jew, and that's what he believed. He said there's not a such thing as heaven or hell. What is heaven is if you lived a good life, people will remember your good works, and they'll remember you, and that's how you live on forever, is through the memories of other people and through the good works that you have done. There's a few problems with that, but one in particular is, and I've asked these questions before, how many of you can name one of your great-great-great-grandparents? Well, if they're living on by what people remember of them, they're gone. There's nothing remembered after a while. You just don't remember all the people that have passed on. So we don't believe in heaven that way, but there are many Jews that do. So you can see what I'm showing here. There's different ways that Jews think about the afterlife, and some of them believe there is no afterlife at all. But we do. And this statement, this phrase here, it makes me wonder why it is that any Jewish teacher would believe that, because in their own scripture that they read in the Torah, it says that he was gathered to his ancestors, or he went to where his ancestors were, ever how you want to state that. He was gathered to his people. So where was he gathered to his people? It couldn't be in the ground, because he wasn't buried the same place his father was buried. Does that all make sense? It gets better. 25:11. After Abraham's death, God blessed his son Isaac, who lived near Beer, the way I would say it, the Lahai-roi. I don't know if that's right or not. This is a Hebrew word. 19th verse. These are the family records of Isaac, son of Abraham. Abraham fathered Isaac. So it's mentioning again that Abraham fathered Isaac. To me, what this is doing, this is tying the covenant to Isaac and reiterating it here towards the last of the book of Genesis, so that we will know that this is the covenant son. This is the one the covenant's being passed through. You remember the title of what we're talking about tonight is Passing on the Covenant. 20th verse. Isaac was 40 years old when he took his wife Rebekah, daughter of Bethuel, Aramean, from Padan Aram, and the sister of Laban, the Aramean. Isaac prayed to the Lord on behalf of his wife because she was childless. 21, second half of that. The Lord heard this prayer, and his wife Rebekah conceived. But the children inside her struggled with each other, and she said, "Why is this happening to me?" So she went to inquire of the Lord. And the Lord said to her, "Two nations are in your womb. Two people will come from you and be separated. One people will be stronger than the other, and the older will serve the younger." So we're looking at here where it's talking about who Isaac was. Well, Isaac was 40 years old when he got married. And then we'll find out he was 60 years old when he had his two sons. So if you remember, how old was Abraham when his first son was born? When Isaac was born, he was 100. So it was 13 years before then when Ishmael was born. So it's an interesting. They didn't get in a hurry to get married and have children back then, is all I can tell you. So anyway, we have this, and we've read this story many times about Esau and Jacob and what happened with them. And I said, was there a significance in the fact that Sarah and Rebekah were barren, and that through an act of God, they bore children? Is that significant? What significance would you see in it? I'm going to tell you, I think it's significant. So why would you think I would say that? And it took a miraculous happening for either one of them to have children. So it shows God being active in the covenant and passing on the covenant from one generation to the next generation. It shows his hand and shows him being active in that. So this was, to me, this reaffirms more to me, this was God's plan. This wasn't something that some Jew sitting in the backside of Abraham or Moses or somebody sitting in the backside of a desert somewhere was writing things down. This is what they wrote. This is what God did, and this is what God had planned. And so by showing this, the miraculous nature of these children being born, it adds even another element to it. There is no indication here. It says that God spoke to her, to Rebekah. But there's no indication anywhere that he'd even spoken to Isaac before then. Now, Isaac is over 40 years old. And my next question, do you think she told Isaac what God told her? What did God tell her? The older would serve the younger. As we get into the story, what did Isaac want? He wanted the older to be the one. And so Rebekah, if she told him, he didn't pay any attention to her and God either one. That could have been. They were getting old enough then they forgot all about it. So what are you talking about? The older will do what? Which one's the oldest? That's probably probably remember by that time. 24th verse. That's a pretty good point. When her time came to give birth, there were indeed twins in her womb. The first one came out red-looking, covered with hair like a fur coat, and they named him Esau. After this, his brother came out grasping Esau's heel with his hand, so he was named Jacob. Isaac was 60 years old when they were born. So he was 40 when he got married. He was 60 when they were born. So he had his sons when he was 60 years old. And it says, there's different people have different interpretations of it. Says he was named Esau, and some say Esau, that comes from the word that sounds like red, so or hairy. So he could have been if in English, I guess we'd have named him Harry. So an English name, but some say that. But if you see on Jacob's name now, his name has to do with heel or grabbing a heel or supplanter. In other words, he's the one that supplanted the one that's supposed to get the birthright by birth, was supposed to be the oldest son. That's who it's supposed to be. But who wound up with it? Jacob wound up with it. 27. When the boys grew up, I like this story because you just think about this story. You've heard it a million times, so pretend you haven't. When the boys grew up, Esau became an expert hunter, an outdoorsman. But Jacob was a quiet man and stayed at home. Isaac loved Esau because he had a taste for wild game. Now, he liked his oldest son because of what? He liked meat. That's a good reason to prefer one son over the other. But anyway, because he had a taste for wild game. But Rebekah loved Jacob. Who was right? The one that was supposed to be the one that passed on the birthright, that was supposed to pass on the covenant to the next generation, was not Esau. It was Jacob, and God had told her that before they were born. He said, the elder will serve the younger. Once when Jacob was cooking a stew, this 29th verse, Esau came in from the field exhausted. He said to Jacob, let me eat some of that red stuff. This we different translations say it different way. Some of that red stuff because I'm exhausted. That is why he was named Edom, and Edom has to do with the color red as well, depending on who you read after. 31st verse. Jacob replied, first sell me your birthright. Okay. He said, any of you who've heard me teach on Genesis know what I think about this particular situation. People talk about, from the time I was little, about how Jacob was such a foul character because he was playing tricks on his brother and buying his birthright for soup and tricking him by when it came a time that for him to get his birthright, he tricked his father into blessing him. But I say, if Isaac had been paying attention to God, there would have been a problem. The bad guy in the situation, as far as I'm concerned, was Isaac, not Jacob. But that's just my opinion. And look what Esau said. He said, first sell me your birthright. Look, 32nd verse there. Look, said Esau, I'm about to die. You think the fellow was about to die? You think he was about to starve to death on the spot? You think he was that bad off? Well, that's what he said. He said, I'm about to die, so what good is a birthright to me? This thing not any good to me, I'm about to croak. Jacob said, swear to me first. So he swore to Jacob and sold his birthright to him. How valuable was the birthright to Esau if he would sell it for a bowl of soup? Is there anything of value that you have that you sell for a bowl of soup? I wouldn't sell one of my cars for a bowl of soup, much less a birthright. 34th verse. Then Jacob gave bread and lentil stew to Esau. He ate, drank, got up, and went away. So Esau despised his birthright. You see how that's written? Esau despised his birthright. It doesn't say, so Jacob tricked him out of his birthright by selling it, by trading it, the birthright, for a bowl of soup. It doesn't say that. It says Esau despised his birthright. This birthright, this covenant, had to be passed on to the next generation in order for the covenant to prosper. And you take somebody like Esau, and this where it says despised his birthright, it said the Hebrew word, a primitive root, and it says despise, disdain, contempt, contemptible, think, to scorn, vile person. No. And let's see how it talks about Esau in the book of Hebrews. 12th chapter, verse 16. And make sure that there isn't any immoral or irreverent person like Esau who sold his birthright in exchange for one meal. King James Version says, lest there be any fornicator or profane person as Esau, who for one morsel of meat sold his birthright. So this word that it says fornicator here, that up there it says immoral, that comes from this Hebrew word here. And look, you recognize the word? It comes from the word pornos, whichever way they pronounce it. And what it means, it says a male prostitute. It says, by analogy, a debauchee, a libertine, fornicator, whoremonger. That's what this word means. And it's describing Esau with these words. Does it sound like God really liked Esau very much? The writer said, unless you be a libertine, a male prostitute, a fornicator, a whoremonger like Esau. All Esau did was sold his birthright. But that was a horrible thing. It was more serious than what we think about. If I sold my inheritance to one of my brothers, that would be, and I sold it for a bowl of soup, that would be stupid. But it wouldn't, and it would affect my generation, the generations after me to some degree, but it wouldn't affect the whole of mankind like this did. What Esau did was much more despicable. Why was the birthright so important? And that's what I was just talking about. For us, for the Jewish people, the reason it was so important is because that's what passed down the covenant to the next generation, to the next generation, to the next generation, to the next generation, and kept it intact and kept it functioning until it got to the point where the Messiah could come into the world. So it meant a lot to us as well as them. Who shared his father's and grandfather's values more, Esau or Jacob? Jacob. Who should have gotten the birthright? Jacob. Who did Isaac want to give the birthright to? Esau. Isaac going to give the birthright to Esau because he liked meat. He was a meat eater and he liked the wild game, so he wanted to pass it on to Esau. We don't know what he was told. Who could be trusted better with the birthright and passing down the covenant? Isn't that the one you'd give it to? Well, when we see this, then to me it makes a lot more sense than the way I grew up hearing this story. Because we understand that the one could be trusted with it was Jacob. So Jacob wasn't as devious and bad a person as what people make. There's a lot of preachers in the past and Sunday school teachers have said when they're talking about the two of them, you'd think that Jacob was just Esau was a sterling character and Jacob was just terrible. He was horrible. He was a deceiver. But which one sold his birthright for a bowl of soup? Which one sold your salvation for a bowl of soup? You put it that way, it makes a difference. Any questions?